Welcome everybody to the practical turn donk follow-up video. If you haven't seen the first one on the main channel, go ahead check that out right now. We're going to move through things pretty quickly today. It's going to be a pretty good comprehensive practical overview on how to implement donks, super high EV video, and we'll structure things so that the higher EV stuff is going to come first. So let's start off with just a very quick overview of the data. This is going to be a quick recap from that video. So if we turn our attention to the single raised pot in position preflop raiser, there is a decent amount happening on the turn. So first of all, our opponents are not overfolding on the turn, but they are slightly under raising. Then on the river, they are overfolding a little bit versus that barrel. They also get into this node fairly often because they don't raise often enough. So this overfold then becomes a bit more significant. We see the same overall trend if we are playing versus the single raised pot in position preflop caller, so donking and then following up is always going to be a little bit profitable, and we'll talk about how to actually implement that on different turns. I also mentioned we'll talk about river donking in this video a tiny bit, not as much as the turn donking because that's not the focus of the video, but river donks are generally going to be very profitable because people overfold and underraise both as SRP IPPFR and as IPPFC. Now, if you're one of my coaching students, then you might be interested in the beta scores. If you don't know what beta scores are, check out the private coaching page on my website, linked somewhere down in the description, probably in the comments and included in the video. The beta score is just going to tell us how much EV we will win when we take this line, and the beta score, if our opponent bets 75% on the flop, is around 0.4, and it's around 0.3 if our opponent bets 30% on the flop. Again, there's a very good overview of what beta scores are and why they're so important in the private coaching page on my website, so definitely check that one out. So let's actually stop here for a moment and talk about why turn donking is going to be good in general. So when we are playing on the turn and we have the opportunity to donk or to check, we are going to be checking and there's going to be a few things happening. Our opponent is going to bet some percentage of the time, and they're going to check some percentage of the time. My students will know how to play against both our opponent's bet and our opponent's check very effectively, but this is also another option that we have. I talk about the theoretical reason for donking in the first video, so now let's actually go through some hands and go through the thought process of donking on the turn. I want to do this part incredibly interactive, so we're going to play a game together. And this game is called Do We Donk Here? You can see that I have a sim loaded up. In this particular sim, we're playing as big blind versus button on 7-7-3, button bets small, big blind calls, and then the turn is 7 of diamonds. So my question to you guys is, do we donk here? And the answer for this one is actually yes. So we are donking here. The 7 is the only card where we're really doing any donking as big blind in this particular line. And it doesn't happen incredibly often, but we do have more full houses than our opponent by a little bit. Our full houses are about 9% of our range, and then our opponent's is only 7.9% of their range. They still have a lot of overpairs, but they have a lot of air, and so we can actually use our new nut advantage here to sort of push our equity with our underpairs, bet some of our ace highs, get folds from overcards, etc. It's a nice pattern to memorize. Now the question is, would I implement donks here, and how would I do that? And the answer is yes. In general, whenever we have a donk strategy, first of all, it's nice to play a little bit close to Nash, but second of all, we also have to acknowledge that because bluffing is going to be good, it's going to give us an alternative route to potentially getting an overfold from our opponent. We understand that if we were to bet here and then follow up with a river barrel, there is going to be a bit of an overfold. Now the alternative is that we check on the turn and we don't have a donking strategy. Well, in that case, it's fine. If our opponent checks back, we can certainly bluff in check call, check bet, and that's always going to be a little bit profitable, but we can't always do that, and we certainly cannot abuse that line. So for me, whenever I see that we have an opportunity to take that turn donk, I like to actually take it because I know that I can split up my air between both of those lines, and that's going to be more profitable as a whole. It's also nice to put our opponent in this very tricky line. You'll notice that after we bet small and our opponent calls, on the river, we are going to have those 3 different bet sizes that we talked about. We're going to have the small size, the medium size, and then the very big size. The big size is going to be very interesting to use because our opponent's defending threshold versus that one on these boards is typically going to be the overpairs. Now, it's really easy for our opponents to call pocket queens or call pocket jacks, maybe they're not aware that their defending threshold is this high, so I think it's a nice line for us to put value in, especially if we're really aggressive in other lines when our opponent's defending threshold is low. I typically like to take the approach of bluffing when my opponent has very unintuitive defense, and I like value betting a lot more when our opponent's calling threshold is much, much higher. So this happens to be one of those spots where I think exploitatively it makes a lot of sense for us to use this sizing scheme. Let's now look at a related board. So this is going to be the same overall bet sizing scheme. Our opponent's betting small, we're calling, and the board is now 5-4-4-4. So it certainly looks like a very similar board. I'm going to ask you guys once again, do we donk here? The answer is no. This board is very different from the other one. We have almost no value because quads are going to be very, very heavily blocked by the board, and then our opponent has all of the strong overpairs. Blocker effects are pretty significant, so this board is overall very, very different from that previous one. Let's move on to our third board, and this one's going to be a little bit different. We're still playing as big blind versus button, but now button is using a larger flop c-bet. So we're assuming that they have bet 75% of the pot. If you've seen that first video, then you'll know exactly what the answer is here. But just in case you haven't seen it, or and just to quiz you, should we donk here? And the answer is yes. After our opponent uses a larger flop c-bet, in general there will be more donking on the turn on equity switching cards, because ranges are a lot more condensed, and so they're a lot more prone to those big equity swings that cause us to donk. So on flush closing turns, there will be a donking strategy here. Now we already discussed the exploitative merit of donking, so all I want to do is just show you button's response versus that small donk. Again, they should be raising very, very often. There's a lot of top pairs raising, there's a lot of bluffs coming from third pairs, ace highs, and whatnot. So it's going to be pretty nice for us to donk here with a lot of medium showdown value, because we're probably not going to be facing a lot of pressure. We know that our opponents in general are going to under-raise. It can definitely feel pretty intimidating to donk with a hand like Queen 4 here, but when our opponents don't apply enough pressure by raising, either by bluffing enough or by value betting thinly enough, then it's very nice for us to take this small donk, because the alternative, which is checking, is probably going to be worse when our opponent has an easier time bluffing the right amount, value betting the right amount, and then also following that up with a river barrel. This is going to be another interesting one, which certainly demonstrates a specific concept. So here we are once again facing a small bet on the flop. So we're facing B30 and then we're calling. The turn is going to be the ace of clubs. Once again, do we donk here? So the answer is no, but this one's a little bit spicy. So the reason we're not donking here is actually because we should be donking on the flop with a lot of our 5x, and then we're also raising a lot of 5x versus that small bet. So because we filter out our range quite considerably on the flop, there's actually no donking here happening, despite the fact that this is a 4-card straight. If we switch the board out to a different 4-card straight board, so maybe we'll do something like 6-5-4-3, then there will actually be a little bit of donking happening from big blind in the sizing scheme. And the donking frequency is only going to increase when the board is a little bit lower, because there we're going to have more low cards, so therefore a bit more of an advantage. So just to quickly demonstrate, if we switch the board out to 9-8-7-6, both players are going to have a lot of 10x, so there's actually not really a donking strategy happening on the turn. Okay everybody, I've had to move my camera down here since we're looking at river donking spots. So the sizing scheme is very important to note. Here our opponent is button and they bet small on the flop, then they go for the B125 overbet on the turn, and the river is a king. So I'll pause the video again and let you guys decide. Do we donk here? So the answer is yes, but it's a little bit tricky. Turn donking is pretty easy to spot, there's a lot of consistent patterns, and because people are playing relatively balanced on the flop, we can still sort of estimate what the ranges really look like. On the river, that becomes a lot more difficult because our opponents now have had the opportunity to deviate from Nash twice, once on the flop and then once on the turn. In addition, because we're playing on the river, I tend to be a little bit more exploitative here. So when I'm thinking about implementing river donks, all I'm really looking for is a potential range asymmetry between both players, and then I think about constructing my overall range pretty exploitatively. So I definitely think donking is going to be quite nice here. If we go ahead and see how our opponents should respond versus B30, you'll see that they should be raising a lot of their hands. So this includes bluff raising a ton of air at a very high frequency, and we know from data that our opponents are simply not doing that. In addition, people will overfold on average, which probably suggests that people aren't calling enough second pairs, maybe ace highs as well. This is always going to be a pretty big chunk of the calling range on various boards. And so I think block betting is going to be very nice exploitatively. In terms of the hand classes that actually benefit a lot from our opponent's mistake, it is going to be the medium strength hands when our opponent is not raising often enough, and it's also going to be our bluffs. It's going to be anything weaker than the strong hands that our opponent would bet themselves. So this means that if we're holding the nuts, something like King 7, then we're actually hurt a little bit by our opponent's mistake. Donk betting this hand becomes a little bit worse because they don't raise enough, and they also don't call enough. We can solve this problem in two ways, either by having a very unbalanced donking strategy, which to be honest is entirely fine. It's going to work long term, people are not going to catch up on it, but we can also implement a second donk size. To demonstrate this, what I've done is I've jumped in GTO Wizard AI and I locked our opponent to overfold and then also underraise versus that small donk. As you can see, we're now donking with our entire range for that small bet size, except for our stronger hands, King 7, King 5, and King Jack. When I give the solver this overbet option, it's just going to prefer to bet these hands. So it's definitely fine to do that, but you can also just check these hands, allow your opponent to put in the money, and then go for the check raise. I think what it really boils down to is if you think your opponent's going to be bluffing often enough in bet, and also how they will play versus that very big river donk. So there's definitely a lot of exploitative concepts at play. One of those is, does it actually make sense to introduce this big river donk bet? Should we bluff for that size? How can we play this? And a lot of these concepts apply to other spots as well. So they will apply to you if you are playing a button in the single raise pot in position preflop raiser, as an example. But they'll apply in 3-bet pots, they'll basically apply all over the game tree. And that's the sort of stuff that I answer in the coaching. I give people a theoretical breakdown, I give an exploitative breakdown using the data, and I leave people with a good blend of both that will help them play better. So if you found this whole video helpful, if you found the previous video helpful as well, definitely navigate to the private coaching website, linked in the description, linked in the comments. Check it out, watch the video, understand the beta and gamma scores, and then reach out to me for your consultation. I'm excited to help you improve. With that said, thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.